Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melie, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, friends, and welcome back to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. I'm Melie, and I am so glad that you pressed play today. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a confession. Sometimes my brain acts like it's auditioning for a disaster movie. If I don't hear back from someone pretty quickly, my brain will tell me I've ruined the friendship and that I'm destined to die alone. If my car makes a funny sound, well, clearly it's about to explode and strand me off on the side of the road, living off the stale granola bar that's probably in the trunk of my car. Does that sound familiar? If so, you're not broken, you are human. And today we are going to unpack why our brains default to worst-case thinking, what faith has to say about it, and how you can actually retrain your brain so that hope becomes your default setting instead of fear. So first, let's name what is this default that we all seem to go to. Psychologists call this catastrophizing. This is when your brain writes full-length disaster movies about stuff that hasn't even happened yet. You know, you sneeze and your brain and Dr. Google says, ooh, you might have a rare illness. Your boss sends you that one-line email or Slack message that says, let's meet later, and you start mentally updating your resume. You have a friend who's gone quiet on you, and you are sure the friendship is over, or that they're lying in a ditch somewhere. It's almost funny when we describe it out loud, right? But in the moment, it feels really heavy, overwhelming, and very real. And the truth is, you are not doing this because you're weak. You're doing it because your brain has been trained into this pattern. But the good news is patterns can be retrained. There are so many stories that I could tell you from my own life where I've done this, but one that gets me every time is that Slack or Teams message, "Have a minute?" from a supervisor. Now, I think part of this is due to the fact that I did go through a layoff a couple years ago, although in that instance, no one was kind enough to say have a minute to warn me before it happened. Suddenly, about 35% of the company was just let go. But I think because of my negativity-biased brain, combined with that very real experience of the layoff, combined with good old RSD, and if you don't know what that is rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which I'm going to dive into shortly. But that "can we talk" or "have a minute" message can send me into a tailspin. Please tell me I'm not the only one. Of course, there is science to back this stuff up. So let's dig into the brain science of why fear feels like our default setting. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister and colleagues, which was published in the Review of General Psychology in 2001, found that bad is stronger than good. What that means is our brains are more sensitive to negative events than positive ones. That's why you can get 10 compliments and then one criticism, and it's that one criticism that keeps you up at night. And I think about, kind of similar to this, the episode, if you are a Seinfeld fan, you might remember it, where there's that one person that doesn't like Seinfeld and he goes to great lengths to try to figure out, why does this one person not like me? I totally get that. Another science fact is our misunderstood amygdala. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux wrote a book in 1996 called The Emotional Brain, and it explained how your amygdala reacts before your rational prefrontal cortex has time to weigh in. This is why you feel your heart pounding before you've even processed a situation logically. Well, in doing some research for this episode, I found a very interesting article in Psychology Today by Ledoux that I wanted to share with you as well. So you may have heard the idea of the amygdala being the fear center of the brain. I know you've heard it if you've listened to this podcast because I've shared it. And people have named Joseph Ledoux as the father of that idea, that the amygdala is the fear center of our brain. But in this article, which is titled, by the way, The amygdala is not the brain's fear center. He states that this idea was a misinterpretation of his findings. So the amygdala, he says, is responsible for detecting and responding to threats. So while we will often feel fear in those situations, the amygdala is apparently not the center of that fear. So, okay, I have learned something here as well. Feel free to whip out this fun fact next time you're at a party. And of course, let's talk about neuroplasticity. You know how much I love neuroplasticity, and the reason is because it is such good news that our brains can change. So how do they change? Well, you might remember that doing little tiny daily practices, things like gratitude, you could write in a gratitude journal, mindfulness, just practicing being present, reframing thoughts as they come up. I like to do this one because I do tend to really have some deeply ingrained negative thoughts. So I will purposely reframe them. So I'll say, okay, this is the thought that I'm having. What else could be true here? These things will reshape the brain's circuitry over time. That means that hope is not just wishful thinking, it is something that you can train your brain into. And fear is not the final word. We as Christians have our faith, and the Bible has a lot to say about fear. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. Do not be anxious about anything, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds. That's from Philippians 4:6 and 7. So do not fear, for I am with you. Isaiah 41:10. Notice what God never says. He never says, don't fear because nothing bad's going to ever happen to you. He says, don't fear because I am with you. Even in the book of Lamentations, when Jerusalem was in ruins, the writer says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His mercies are new every morning. That's from Lamentations 3:22-23. And that is not naive optimism. That is fierce hope in the rubble. So faith doesn't erase our fear, but it does reframe it. It anchors us so that fear doesn't get the final word. Now, let's talk about a factor that makes worst-case thinking even more intense for some of us. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. If you've never heard of it, RSD is when your brain reacts with extreme emotional pain to perceived rejection. This is a factor for many neurodivergent folks with ADHD, and ADHD researcher Russell Barkley has written that people with ADHD often experience rejection more intensely because of differences in emotional regulation, although RSD itself is not an officially recognized diagnosis. And here's what makes it tough. There have been countless studies, one particular by Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman, which was published in Science in 2003, that found that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. That's why rejection can feel like a gut punch. Your brain is experiencing it like an injury. For people with RSD, that pain is magnified. A friend not texting back can feel like an abandonment. A little feedback at work can make you feel like a total failure. But faith reframes that rejection too. Jeremiah 31:3 says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Ephesians 2:10 calls us God's workmanship. Even when people let us down, God's verdict on us doesn't change. So how do we actually shift our default setting from fear to hope? Here today for you is a little toolbox that you can use. Take any of these exercises that feel good and use these whenever you start feeling yourself going into that fear-based negative thought loop. Number 1 is pause and breathe. Try something where you're inhaling, holding, and then exhaling longer than you inhaled. So you could try a 4-7-8 breathing pattern. That would mean you would inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. This will calm down your amygdala. 2, you can ask, what else could be true? If your brain automatically says to you, they didn't reply, so they obviously hate me, ask yourself, what else could be true? Could they just be busy? Do a scripture swap. So replace your fear thoughts with God's promises. Remember, Philippians 4:8 tells us to think on what is true, noble, right, and pure. So whatever your specific fear is, Find a scripture that speaks to that. And then when you feel that fear coming on, you can recite it to yourself. If you're not great at memorization, that's fine. Write it down. Have it on a card by your desk. Maybe have one taped to a mirror. Have one, on a keychain, wherever you are going to see it when it matters most. Another option is to interrupt the pattern. This is actually, it seems simple, but it really works. So when you feel that negative thought loop starting to spiral, do something different. Go outside, move your body, turn on worship music. Movement will break up the mental loops. Practice gratitude. You know that I talk about gratitude journaling all the time, and that I actually started gratitude journaling right when I was in the middle of my divorce. But gratitude practices will strengthen your neural pathways of positivity. Try also doing a delay response. This one is particularly good for those of us who suffer from RSD. Wait before reacting. If you can, wait 24 hours before reacting to perceived rejection. Often it is during this time that your feelings will settle and clarity will come. I cannot tell you how many times I have caused myself such real pain, and others as well, by not waiting before reacting. So, I'm just going to tell on myself here because I like to be very honest on this podcast, and hopefully my honesty will help you. But as I was starting to date and get out there, after my divorce, I wasn't used to this whole, and I've done a couple episodes on this, the whole new landscape of dating, and everything is happening on these apps. And everything is on text. And it's very weird. It's not something, even 4 years in, I am still not comfortable with the way things are. However, this is the world that we're living in, for better or worse right now, with dating. So I would connect with someone, and in just usual Melie fashion, I would go all in. I would be like, ooh, I really like this person. And so I really am going to text them and share all my feelings, which you shouldn't really do in text, I've come to learn, but I didn't know. I would write out my text like I was talking. And no, I was not using voice to text. I was typing everything out with my hands, but I was sharing a lot, And so people would have not the greatest response to that. Some people had a better response than others, but I didn't always get the warm welcome that I was hoping for. Or maybe somebody would send something like, "K," or, "Oh, cool," when I shared my heart. And I would kind of freak out in my head, which then I would freak out on the text and send all this, "I guess you don't like me." And oh my goodness, horrible, right? Just horrible. Had I waited, even if I had waited, forget 24 hours in these instances, if I had just waited 10 minutes to gather myself and to do something else and to breathe and maybe take a sip of water before I just went and responded, I would have saved myself so much pain and probably saved these other folks so much stress. So take it from me, that delayed response is huge. Another thing you can try is writing it down. So journaling can help slow down your racing thoughts and help your brain shift from a reactive mode to a reflective mode. I love journaling. I journal just about every day. I've mentioned that I have my gratitude journal. It's actually a bigger journaling practice. So I start with the gratitude, then I will actually write out a Bible verse by hand. And then I will go to a journal page and just write down my thoughts for the day. But I even do this in another journal that I have, sometimes just on a random piece of paper. If I am having a moment where I am really struggling or have all these racing thoughts, I will write it down. Sometimes I do it in the form of a prayer to God. I'll release it to Him and say, "Lord, please take this from me. Please help me get through this. Please help me understand what's happening. Please calm my heart. Please calm my mind." And sometimes I will just write out what's going on. So-and-so said this, I am feeling that. And just kind of, when I can see it all on the page, there's just something very therapeutic about that. So here is what I want you to remember and take away with you today. Fear may always try to shout louder, but it doesn't get the last word. Your brain may still lean worst case scenarios sometimes, but that doesn't mean that you're powerless. And hope is not naive. It's a practice. It's neuroplasticity, and it's faith in action. Neuroscience tells us that our brains can be rewired, and Scripture tells us that our spirits can be renewed. Together, that means that your story doesn't end in fear, it keeps moving toward hope. If this episode encouraged you today, would you share it with a friend who struggles with worst-case thinking? And please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss what's coming next. Remember, fear may be loud, but hope always gets the last word. That's a wrap on this episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If you're walking through the ashes right now, remember, you're not broken. You are becoming. Don't forget to subscribe, share with a friend who needs it, and come back next week for more faith, honesty, and a whole lot of heart. See you next time.